All right. Hello, everybody. This is Barry, CEO and co-founder at Ivy, and I'm incredibly excited today to be here with Professor Elliot Shore. Elliot, thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So good to have you. So we're going to be talking about how food defines humanity. And this is a subject that I think all of us can deeply relate with on multiple levels. So we're really excited to learn from you. Your latest book was all around the history of the subject. And what I'd like for us to do through the course of this conversation is to really understand how the concept of eating out developed, what food means to us as humans in our culture, across different cultures, and what we can all learn from an actionable perspective from you, so that next time we're eating out or we're having a very interesting conversation on this topic, we have a lot to offer. So to get us started, I'd love to ask you first, how come you decided to write this book? What got you so interested in the subject, and why do you think it's important?
I think I've always been interested in the subject. I had a wonderful grandmother who was a fantastic cook, and it sort of skipped a generation, if I might say. And I was interested in the taste that she had developed in me, and started cooking myself. Very early on, and then cooking in for friends, and then when I was at college, and just got really terribly interested in all the different ways that food tastes. So I think it's a very early interest in eating and cooking that got me interested in this. And a number of talks over the years. I'm a historian of all kinds of different things. I'm not one of those historians who could stick with one topic for my entire life. And I remember doing a session on the joy of cooking cookbooks, and thinking about how interesting that was, and then moved on to this book. Actually, to a chapter in a book called Food: The History of Taste. So if the listeners in like this book, they might love the book Food: The History of Taste, which was the first serious modern book on the history of food across the world. And that chapter led to this book. I wrote a chapter called Dining Out in the West, which was picked up by a wonderful publisher at Reaction Books in London. So I think that's the short history of that. But can I add something else, Barry? You
Please.
said that eating out and being human are deeply connected. And actually, we start the book by thinking about eating in period turned us into humans. And it was a technological thing that we did. We started to smash food up and cut it up into smaller pieces. And that's what essentially leads to Homo sapiens becoming who they are. So we didn't spend as much time chewing as anybody else on the planet. So it's a very simple kind of technological change, led most scientists think to us becoming human. So it's a basic part of who we are.
I love that. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And just to build on what you said, so just recently it was the Jewish high holidays, and one of those holidays is Yom Kippur. So there was no eating for a day. And it's incredible how just one day without food is a huge challenge for us. So from a purely physical perspective, we obviously need food. However, as human, just like any other animal, right? However, as humans, we've elevated that experience to something that's actually deeply profound. So yes, sometimes we're running around and grabbing a quick sandwich, but most of the times when we decide to grab a meal with someone or visit them in their home for a meal, it means something pretty substantial who we choose to eat with. And that's why, from my perspective, when we had this opportunity to host you for this conversation, what excited me a lot was the opportunity to give our members a perspective on something they do regularly, but a perspective where they can really understand, like, how does this fit in with human civilization, history, trends, and what we value the most. So with all of that in mind, we rewound the clock all the way back when you mentioned like, okay, we started cutting up food in the first place. I'd love for you to give us like, in a nutshell, an overview of how eating together came about,
Hmm.
and then how it developed. What were the norms through history? When did it coalesce into like eating out versus not doing that? If you could just give us a kind of a bird's eye view historically of like what the key trends have been when it comes to eating together and eating outside, and then we'll go deeper from there.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. And one of the things that pushed me towards writing this book with Katie Rawson is the fact that historians think about where things start. And you go to a restaurant today and you think there's always been a restaurant. It's always been there. We've always done that. But that's not the case, right? Obviously, it started somewhere. So the first we know about people eating together in public, I think would be a fair way to say you're not eating just with your relatives. You're not eating either at home or outside your home, but you're eating together with other people. Happens about, you know, we're not in the Chalcolithic era, and we find people using. The reason we know this are mass-produced bowls that people were actually paid with their labor with a bowl filled with food, and they obviously ate it together on the job. And that's like the first time we think people are actually eating together in public. It turns out that the most important eating out together in public was either a religious or a spiritual moment. And so talking about Yom Kippur as a place, a spiritual moment when you don't eat, the first times that we know organized ways of eating out together in public were spiritual moments where people ate out. And the term for that is commensality, or eating together. And so the whole notion of eating together is 5, 6, 7,000 years old. And it takes until the 11th century or the beginning of the 12th century in China for all of the pieces to come together that look like a restaurant. So we have people, there are people eating out on the road, but they're just getting food from somewhere that's already cooked. In Athens, we have the symposium, where people are sitting together and drinking together, and there are lots of pieces of the restaurant there. These are things that have to do with drinking, have to do partially with eating, have to do with sex and gender roles, and have to do with this enjoying one another. The Romans called that the convivium, the same kind of a thing. So you could, there's a tavern culture all over the world where you could get something to drink, and maybe you could get a sausage or something to eat with it. And so in the book, we have all kinds of wonderful little anecdotes about the kinds of things that we complain about today, people getting drunk or eating outside or acting badly. It's been going on for a very long time. So but it takes until the 12th century for all of the pieces of what we know of a restaurant to come together. Food cooked for you, a menu, prices on the menu, a waiter who would bring you the food, and then a bill at the end that said, this is how much you should pay. So it takes from, let's say, the second or third millennium before the Common Era till the end of the first millennium of this era to create all of the pieces of the puzzle that lead to the restaurant. You have to fast forward another 500 to 600 years for it to happen in Paris. And that's where as you can imagine, the first restaurants in the West begin in the middle of the 18th century. We're not exactly sure, in the 1760s, and then it takes off until then. One of the problems in writing a book like this is the things that people do every day are not usually recorded in ways that historians are used to using certain sources. So we had to use all kinds of things, drawings, novels, archaeological digs. Those kinds of things were where we rested that information. And even the beginnings of restaurants in the 18th century, we probably know less about them than we do about the Chinese restaurants in the 12th century. Is that far
Yeah.
enough to the future? Okay, thank you.
That was excellent. That was excellent. So just to my key takeaways from there to summarize, so there was this 5 to 7,000 years ago, spiritual religious moments were celebrated by eating together. And then key kind of inflection points you mentioned. So Greeks had the, you call it the symposium, Romans had the conviviums, and these ways to drink and be merry together and do all these different things. And then tavern culture, so going for a drink, having a bite, that was also going on. And then the two additional inflection points, you said 12th century China, that's where you see the first formation of like a modern concept of a restaurant coming around. And then France in mid 18th century, so prior to the revolution, people were starting to eat out. What I'd like to do is like, before diving deeper into like present day and different themes, is kind of, you know, what was the specific functions played by these different ways of people eating together? What were people looking to get out of it, above and beyond, obviously, the food? What were the different functions? And also, what was the impact on society when people started doing this more? So I guess my question is, above and beyond just like you're hungry, so you eat, what was actually the function of this? How has that evolved? And then if you could take us to the present day from these historical examples you gave us on how it evolved, I think that'd be very helpful.
So why don't I start with the Chinese in the 12th century, jump to the French in the 18th century, and then see if we can move further. The reasons that the full restaurant culture developed in China, we think, again, these are speculations, but I think they're pretty well grounded, have to do with the fact that there are two cities in China with more than 1 million population in the 12th century, where the largest cities in Europe are in Italy, France, and in England, and they have 200,000 people in Paris and in Milan, and only 100,000 in London. So we're talking about a concentration of people like in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Miami, those kinds of things. So you need a concentration. The second thing you need is a reason to not be able to eat in your normal way. And that has to do with Hangzhou and Kaifeng being crossroads for merchants. So we're talking about business. We're talking about the kinds of, you know, people are traveling for business. And one of the coolest things that happens in China right away is the ethnic restaurant. Because the people from northern China did not want to eat southern Chinese cuisine, and the people in southern China, and this is still true today, did not want to eat northern Chinese cuisine. So when you go to those two cities, there are ethnic restaurants of all kinds for all kinds of different food forms. And there also is the development right away. One thing I didn't mention is there was another function of the restaurant, which is probably still the function of some restaurants. The French called it the cabinet particulier. I don't know the Chinese term, but it was the private room upstairs that you had to know existed, where people of different genders met together, and one of the things they did was eat. And those kinds of restaurants were available in China in the 12th century, and in Paris in the 18th century, and in the United States in the 19th century, and everywhere else in the world. So so it's that connection, it's the population, it's the movement of people for business. And the third piece of this is the change in government structures. There's an important change. I won't go into the details. In China, there's much more of a participatory way of governing. And as you mentioned, Paris in the 18th century was roiled by the bourgeoisie trying to take control. So it was illegal in Paris to start a restaurant, because there were guilds that owned all of the pieces of the puzzle. They open, if you wanted to buy a sausage, you would go to the place where you buy a sausage. If you wanted soup, you go to the place where you buy soup. Most people, by the way, in the world, did not eat at home unless they were very wealthy until the middle of the 19th century. So we're talking about so there are no restaurants where you could have all kinds of food, but the term restaurant is actually based on an idea that the people who had been used to eating at home, nobility, the upper bourgeoisie, were tired of these amazing, they had to get dressed for dinner, they had to come down to these elaborate kinds of meals. And so the word restaurant, I don't know if anyone's ever thought about what it means. It means restorative. It means chicken soup, literally bouillon. And you would go and sit alone in the restaurant to have a quiet time by yourself. It's just a kind of an interesting flipping of the whole story. And then immediately it develops over about a 10-year period into the full panoply of what a restaurant looks like today. So there's some interesting twists and turns in this story.
Fascinating. So I think the concentration of people, big cities, obviously in the more modern times, post-industrial revolution, clearly people moving from agriculture to factories, urbanization, and so on. That explains a lot of the explosion of, restaurants. One thing you mentioned, also one thing I should say before I transition. So restaurants were places for business, for social relations,
right.
And also for political movements and policy discussions. So I think for everybody who's dialed in today and listening to this conversation, I mean, it's a fascinating, actually, conversation starter. Everything that you're sharing, whether it's the next business meeting or the next date or next political discussion you're having at a restaurant, to know how it all started. So I think that's very valuable. You mentioned about the fact that eating at home was something that was reserved for the nobility, these elaborate meals. So I really want to focus now on kind of the history of eating out and eating together as it relates to just economics in general. So some of it is to do with trade and cities that are at crossroads, but also I want to talk about different classes of people. So when the nobility were having all these super fancy meals, that were prolonged affairs, what were everybody else doing? What were they eating? And how has there been a convergence, and how is there still maybe some, from a class and economical perspective, how are there still differences in how people view eating out, and how has that changed over time?
Sounds like a very simple question. Let me see if I can handle that. One of the things that I think is interesting in terms of economics and in terms of business and in things that were sold to people is that the nobility, at least in the West, and probably also in the East, set the example of what high standards of living look like. So, so the notion often was that, for example, furniture or clothing or houses would be the upper middle class or the haute bourgeoisie would look to the nobility and try to imitate that. So, so you see that actually in the beginning of the restaurants. We're talking about the 1760s, the 1770s, and then we're looking at a lot of noble families and the revolution dissolving. And so you have all these incredible cooks who had cooked for the nobility. They don't have those jobs anymore. So they start out in Paris in the 1770s and 80s to cook like they did at home in castles and palaces. So you get a lot of the same kinds of dishes that they would have prepared. And there's a movement throughout the 19th century to move towards that elaborate cooking and then move back down to a kind of cooking that we know today, sort of. So it starts with simple cooking to get away from those meals, and then the development of this incredible French cuisine, which, by the way, was a major export product of France throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. They exported their ways of cooking. They exported chefs who, the first great restaurant in New York City is Delmonico's, and that is a Swiss-French um, chef who starts that. And he brings in more chefs of that sort. And all of the great restaurants in the 19th century in the United States are run by people who were trained in France. In fact, the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the first great World's Fair in the US, literally had an imported French restaurant, which was there in the 1770s, to Philadelphia, to Fairmount Park, and it was recreated there. So literally, it was an export product that develops into, you know, something that is very important for who the French are and how they make money in many ways. And after that, as that's happening, you then have the development of people, as you said, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, you had to start to eat out. You didn't work at home or you didn't work on the farm. So there's the beginning of poor and working class people's restaurants. Since everybody's talking about London right now, the development of fish and chips is something that pulls together a lot of interesting things. It's technological. You could finally refrigerate food on a trawler and get tons and tons of fish coming back that's fresh that you then could sell. And those things were sold out of the front living rooms of people in poor parts of London. So I could go on and on. I probably shouldn't, but so you have this movement in one direction and a movement back down to simplicity at the same time. It's an interesting kind of dance that we're still seeing, right? If you think about it, there's always one trend, let's get it fancier, more expensive, more elaborate, and another one looking for simpler, more elegant kinds of food that is not done so. So hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. That was really excellently put. I love your mention of fish and chips, right?
Yeah.
And because you incorporated their technological developments and so forth. Are there any other dishes like that that we all know or love, or maybe that's not as popular these days, but it played a big role? So as you were writing this book, were there any other kind of specific dish like that that was kind of a good kind of like a coalescing of all these factors, like defining their time that, you know, next time maybe we're ordering that dish, we'd do well to keep in mind?
So there are many of them. The one we spend the most time on in the book is pizza, which brings together another piece of the puzzle, which we haven't talked much about, which is gender. The pizza is a 17th century idea, and it is a place where women, for the first time, start their own businesses. And it was illegal in Italy, just like it was illegal in France to have a restaurant of a certain, with many kinds of foods. But also, if you did sell food, you had to pay taxes. But what the women developed was a way to cook in a way that you could carry the stuff from one place to another. So there were these outdoor ways of cooking and creating these very simple dishes that became a world food through all kinds of different gyrations. So women are running these essentially little booths outside that they could move from one place to another, while at the same time, pizza is becoming more and more of a place where you could sit outside and eat, or you could sit downstairs and eat, or you could sit upstairs and eat. And so you'd have pizza restaurants with 3 different levels of luxury or non-luxury, and then it becomes the food that everyone eats. So it's a technological thing where you could move this way of cooking from one place to another. And it was also a way of avoiding paying taxes, which we all seem to try to do from time to time. I don't know if that's the best example of it, but that's one of the examples in the book.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's talk about the present, or like the near past, present, going into the future. What have been the key trends over the last couple of decades that you found to be most significant? What are kind of points of, key controversy and development? I mean, the point you made about complexity versus simplicity, definitely, like, that's a clear distinction. There's so many restaurants now that's like, we just do the one thing like super well,
Right.
as opposed to, like the so many menu items. And then what do you think are like the key, like looking ahead 5-10 years, what do you think are the key trends that are coming up? So if you could just, I guess, like the near past,
right,
present to the future, what are the key trends on what's going on that we should keep in mind?
So I think the biggest trend is probably hidden from many people, which is the technological change in the back, often in the back of the house. The introduction of computers, the introduction of certain kinds of ways of cooking technologically that are much more sophisticated and much easier to do. The automation that has happened in the back and also out in the front. Those kinds of issues, I think, have moved, and also being able to cook things that you could never cook before. If you think about the Northern European and also Spanish ways of thinking about molecular cooking. So all of those kinds of things, I think, have to do with certain kinds of technological changes. It probably starts in the early 20th century. There are older examples, but the automat is an interesting way to think about the beginning of a truly and that's 1902. It starts actually in Philadelphia, which is a kind of and then moves to New York, the Horn and Hardart chain. And this notion that you're not going to touch the food. Nobody touches it, nobody makes it. It's finished and given to you in a perfect form, as if there's no one behind the those beautiful glass doors. And if we move forward through the kinds of things like a conveyor belt with sushi on it, or going into there's a restaurant now in Japan where there is no one in the restaurant at all. And it's a sushi restaurant, and it's the owner comes by a couple of times a day to take the trash out. But essentially everything is automated. So you have that move, which I think is continuing in that direction. And we have the other move. Let's do slow food as slowly as possible. And there's Scott's Barbecue in the South, where it's not only farm to table, it's literally we grow our own trees and we cut them down and then we chop them up and then we, turn them into charcoal. And, so it's like breaking down every piece of the story into its constituent parts and trying to be able to tell you the story of everything that goes into your meal. So you have, again, these two things going in two directions that I think are moving us to sort of kinds of opposites that are kind of cool. And the third one is the one right in the middle. And we talk about that in a chapter on global dining. One of them is the movement of Chinese food around the world. So we have things like what people call Chinese food in America. We have Cuban Chinese food, we have chifa, we have all of these fusion cuisines. So I think in many ways, there's a new restaurant in Philadelphia, sorry I keep talking about Philadelphia, where all these mashups of crazy kinds of things are coming together. So I think what we're seeing is an efflorescence, and I think when we started writing this book, was the moment in 2017 where Americans, US North Americans, spent more money outside the house, either eating in a restaurant or buying prepared food and taking it home, than money cooking at home. So I think that will continue to be the case. And I think what's happened is eating out will become less special than eating at home. I think eating at home will be like eating in a restaurant 20 or 30 years ago, or eating at the most spectacular restaurant you could think of. In other words, cooking yourself for people who you know. It is a kind of an interesting twist on the whole story. So as a historian, what I love about this is that things keep moving this way, not this way or that way. So they're moving in all directions.
Fascinating. So what's really interesting, like every other industry out there, technology is making its impact.
Absolutely.
So we can automate a lot more and so forth for convenience and all that. On the flip side, some people are then craving the, farm to table or the more extreme versions of that where everything is sourced in a certain way and so forth. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, this like trend that you mentioned about like now it's becoming almost a norm to not be eating at home. And there's going to be this maybe very special thing to being at home. And the final other thing you mentioned just now was this Chinese cuisine and how, I've lived in a few countries. So like first time I had Chinese food was in Turkey. Then I had a lot of Chinese food in Scotland, had a lot of Chinese food in London, in New York. It's all very different, actually.
Absolutely.
Yep. And so, like, I think that what I'd love to dive into next is the cultural component of food.
Mm-hmm.
What completely blew me away, I was born in Turkey, then moved to the UK. And in the UK, I was actually quite surprised that the most popular cuisine in the UK was Indian food,
Yes.
which coming from Turkey made no sense because, like, you would think, Turkey, we've got great food. That's like the main food. And then we have some foreign dishes. How do you see like the role of food dining out as like almost like cultural ambassadorship for certain cultures, and how does that impact things? I'm particularly interested in China just because
Yes.
You said that in the 12th century, that's where the concept of a restaurant coalesced. It seems like that's like incredible like Chinese outposts in
It's
every
still
place.
going on.
Yeah, and as China is now, getting more and more significant on the global stage, what can we learn from that, and what does it also mean for other countries with like very popular cuisines that are getting disseminated across the world?
So I think what you're talking about your own story, and everyone who is not a Native American is an immigrant ultimately from, their families have come from somewhere else. I think the story that you're telling and that we're telling is a story of immigration. And I give you an example. I lived in Taiwan for a couple of years in the 1970s and 80s. And there was a part right near the university where you could eat virtually any cuisine in the world by just walking around a few streets. And that had to do with Chinese folks either being forced out or wanting to leave countries all throughout Southeast Asia. So I could walk from a Nepali restaurant to a Tibetan restaurant to a Laotian restaurant to a Malaysian restaurant to every other kind of Chinese restaurant. And these were all Chinese restaurants because all of the cooks were Chinese. So they brought the cuisine of countries they had already migrated to, and then brought that cuisine back to Taiwan when they were forced out of the countries that they had come from. So what we're talking about is a global movement of populations. And that's, and Chinese laborers were sent to the New World. And one of the things that they demanded, that the Chinese government demanded for them when they got to, let's say, South America, was a ration of rice. And it had to be guaranteed that they would have rice. And then many of them intermarried with people, local people, and these fusion cuisines developed in people's homes. So we're talking essentially about your story, about everybody's story who has moved from one place to another, is that they bring their food ways. One of the things that I found quite fascinating in living in Taiwan at the time was, and also in living in Japan, where I lived for a while, is the one meal that seems like you stick with your own, and I don't know if it's true for you, your own way of eating when you were growing up is breakfast. And breakfast is a hard thing to change for people. And it was interesting in Taiwan that people would experiment a little bit, but not with breakfast. If they were Northern Chinese, they would eat a Northern Chinese breakfast, which had to do with wheat-based things and soy milk. And if you were a Southern Chinese person, you had the rice left over from the night before being warmed up. So I think there are those kinds of cultural differences as well. I think people, you know, develop. I think what we're doing now is trying to imagine what all of these other cuisines look like, and we call it a phantasmagoria of restaurants right now. You really could eat your way across the world in your neighborhood. There's a restaurant that we spend a lot of time on in our global restaurant eating piece that developed in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s, where you could literally eat around the world in one building. They served more than 1 million meals a year. They had a movie theater in it and cafes, and it was an extraordinary place at the center of Berlin. So the notions of eating around the world and global eating, that's at least, if not going back to China, it's at least a century old in the West.
Fascinating. Could you actually share with us, so which countries have the highest number of restaurants per capita and which countries maybe have the lowest, just so we get an idea of, like, you know, where it's most prevalent?
Japan has the most restaurants per person. Right now, I think it's 91 restaurants for every 10,000 people. If you can imagine, it's a tough, it's a pretty tough business to get into. The places that have the fewest restaurants are often the places that have the least developed economies. So if you think about the global South, those are the areas where there would be fewer restaurants per capita of the sort that we're talking about. There would be places to eat like there would have been before there were restaurants, but not as many restaurants. I don't think I could tell you. It would be very hard to tell you because we don't have statistics on those.
Right. And why in Japan, would you say, why is that the highest per capita restaurant?
I think probably, I'm guessing here, but I think it would be true. It is the most highly populated place per square foot on the planet. So, you know, and into the main island of Japan, and especially in Tokyo. If you've been there, you stumble across a restaurant every few feet. So I think that's the reason.
And having done all this research, do you have a final say on which city in the world has the best restaurants?
So you're the answer I have for this is I'm a historian, and you know, we don't know that much about the past. Asking me to think about the present or the future, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Every place I go to, though, I find really interesting restaurants at. And one of the most wonderful things is, you know, people, well, what's the oldest restaurant? What's the oldest restaurant? And every town I go to claims it has the oldest restaurant. So it's a kind of interesting story. And what is a restaurant is the question. And there is one we can trace back in Austria to the 9th century. It's not a restaurant in the sense that we were talking about restaurants. It was a monastery, but it's still in business, and now it's really a restaurant. So it's so have a look at our book, and you can go to that restaurant that is now, what would that make it, 1,300 years old. So
incredible.
It might be fun to go there.
Absolutely.
It's a fancy restaurant today, let me tell you.
Can't wait to check it out, hopefully sometime soon. So what I want to do now is really start weaving in some of the questions that we've been getting from our members as we've had our conversation. So if anybody else has questions, highly recommend for you to type it sooner rather than later in the Q&A box at the bottom. And if you'd like to ask your question directly, please ask under your name. Otherwise, you can just, you know, do it without the name and I'll read it out for you. So the first question we got is as follows. um, there seems to be a lot of pushback nowadays on how addicted we've become to restaurants and takeout in terms of health and weight. I've noticed how home cooking and the meal kit industry is putting a new pressure on parents to make home cooked meals, even though most families don't have a stay-at-home parent.
Right.
Can you talk about how eating out and at home has been put in moral or public health terms in this way in the past?
So one of the, I mean, if you literally go back to the founding of restaurants in Paris, one of the reasons was to get away from overblown, elaborate meals. The French meals were normally served at room temperature and in noble houses, and there were tons and tons of dishes that you could choose from. So when I talked about the earliest restaurants with the restaurant, the chicken bouillon, was an attempt to get away from elaborate eating and overeating. That said, the great restaurant in London of the middle of the 19th century and into the 20th century was run by someone who ate so much food that he had, this is literally true, that he had to have his, he had a special carriage built to get him to the railroad, and then there was a special place in the railroad for him to come into London, and then you know, a special way to get him to the restaurant. So he overate, and overeating in restaurants, you get this in the symposium of people eating too much and drinking too much. It has led in every case to overindulgence in wine, in food. And so it, again, it swings back. Some of the restaurants today now, obviously by law, have to show how many calories are in what they are serving. And I have to say that I look at those numbers very carefully when I have to eat at a fast food place or even in a good restaurant. So I think it's putting the pressure on people who don't have time to cook at home is unfair. And these laws, I think, are helping a little bit. It probably, as we were saying before, it's almost a luxury to cook at home. So in some ways, you almost have to be privileged and sort of upper middle class, or at least middle class, to be able to afford this. And so if we look at the numbers, obesity often happens more in the poor because they don't have that many choices. So I don't know how to answer this question, except it's a mess. It's a total mess. It's, you know, there are all these desires to eat healthy food. Healthy food is often more expensive than not healthy food. So trying to cook at home is a difficult thing to do. Packaged foods that have fewer calories are also seem to be addictive. In some ways, you just eat another one or another one. It's almost like light beer. You keep drinking it to figure out, does it taste like something? Like skim milk, you keep drinking too much of it because there's no fat in it. And so it doesn't satisfy you. So I don't know if there's a really straightforward answer to this problem. I think it's a social problem, and I think it's a economic inequality problem. And I think that the restaurants fill that entire spectrum of you know, trying to deal with this in one way or another. I don't know if that's a good answer. I don't know if there is a good answer. Barry, do you have some thoughts about this? Because it's something that I struggle with as a historian and also someone who has children and have cooked for them their entire lives, but I had the ability to do that.
Yeah, what's fascinating, definitely from my perspective, is the fact that there are also so many now new types of restaurants that really hyper emphasize how healthy the food is, and, you know, smaller portion sizes and like natural. So I think as society shifts towards, I know that growing up, we didn't talk about food being healthy or unhealthy when I was younger. Like it wasn't even a thing. Whereas now it's like a constant part of the dialogue. So while it's true that, you know, very healthy food is still very expensive and highly inaccessible, I do see it as also a big market opportunity that smart restaurant chains and, you know, concepts are capitalizing on. to specifically say, hey, okay, this is actually good for you or better for you.
You know, your audience, this seems like a perfect space to be able to develop a restaurant that is reasonably priced and has the attributes of home cooking. Might be the next killer app for one of the folks in the audience. And they
Absolutely.
should invite the two of us to come visit when they open it.
Yeah. I mean, also just anecdotally, I would say like a third to half of all business ideas and concepts most of us here, I certainly hear, is related to something to do with food, whether it's a restaurant or something, just because it's the definition of the most consumer thing that we can all relate to.
Right.
We've got another question here around, just paraphrasing here, but essentially the question is asking about what is it about us that like we want to be in packed restaurants, right? Like where it's almost to the point of discomfort. And actually, I was mentioning to you something similar before we started the call with everybody else.
Yeah.
What is it like that drives us to wanting to be like where everybody else is, as opposed to like, maybe having a lot more space and comfort?
I've experienced that in New York and in Tokyo, and I think it's in places where there are lots of people and they're used to noise and they're used to that around them. It's I'm not that kind of a person. I don't like that. I think it has to do with where you grow up. I think it has to do with I know when I'm in New York City, I walk more quickly, I talk more quickly, I eat more quickly. You get caught up in that. And in Tokyo, it's the same story. It's this incredible pace of life. There are places like that on this planet that are in some ways what one would call overpopulated, and you have to push and shove your way to the front. I think that might explain some of that. I also remember living in Taiwan and people feeling like they shouldn't just eat with one or two people. It was wrong. There should be more people at the table. They felt funny not being able, to have like an intimate dinner with your lover or wife or friend or colleague or partner was weird in the Chinese culture that I spent a lot of time with. Eating was a communal thing, not something you did by yourself. So I think you're right, it's a cultural issue. And I think it has to do with how you're brought up. I think there are ethnic differences everywhere in the US where you see that, and some places where you see people wanting to be quiet alone in a restaurant. The early restaurants, by the way, in Paris, where you would find poor people looking in through the glass, watching the people eating together. The fancy people who were sitting inside the fancy restaurants were a spectacle for the people who were outside the restaurant. So you had crowds outside of the restaurant looking in to see who was there, what they were eating. And we're talking about the 18 teens and 20s and 30s. So it's also a spectator sport for some people to watch other people sitting together in a restaurant.
Love that. Thank you so much. Next question that came up. You predicted that fusion cuisine will continue to become even more prevalent in the future.
Right.
What is your take from a historical perspective on the concept of cultural appropriation when it comes to cuisine and restaurants?
One of the things that I find hilariously used all the time is authentic cooking, which assumes, or an authentic cuisine, it assumes that there's some kind of moment when the cuisine is finished, right? And that's the authentic way to do things. And any other way to do it is fusion, it's wrong, it's cultural degradation. There are a couple of authentic cuisines in the world. Again, Japan is the place to look for a certain kind of, there's a family in the 24th generation running essentially a tea house with the same recipes from about 800 years ago. So I don't think there are many authentic cuisines in the world. I think almost all of them have been developed by people bringing new ideas to them. So that's, you know, it's like when people look for the original meaning of a word, I don't go for original meanings. I think they're always contested. I think there are always things that are brought into the story, and those things are absolutely important. And that's how human beings develop. I think we tend, as human beings, to say, at a certain time in our lives, we ate the right food that worked well for us, and we're looking for that again. So I think that it's a human desire to have a certain kind of authenticity, and I think fusion will be then the authentic cooking for some people, and wonder, you know, if the next one is. So I'm sorry if that's a unsatisfactory answer, but I don't believe in original meanings and complete beginnings.
And that's in line with, I remember from an anthropology course that this like belief in like pure cultures, that, you know, they had this purity is kind of a big myth because there was no culture that was truly immune from the influence of others. And humanity is this mishmash of like diversity coalescing in different ways. So thank you for that, Elliot. The final question I want to wrap up with, as I mentioned to you before we started the call, IB is a community of rising and established leaders. We all want to have the biggest possible impact we can on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that in our community by learning from incredible individuals like you, different ways in which we can elevate our lives, both professionally, but also personally as well. So with that in mind, what I wanted to ask you is, given that, you know, meal, like we all eat anyway, and we often eat with other people,
Right.
what are different ways, and this is a personal kind of key life mission for me, is what are different ways that we can keep in mind to elevate dining out or eating together with other people based on the historical perspectives you've seen? How have people also endeavored to really elevate that experience to deepen the bonds that eating together can lead to, and also the impact that a meal can have? I found that being intentional about it, really having some kind of a, like not the whole time, but at least a portion of the meal, having some structured way that maybe people answer a question or discuss a certain topic. Would love to hear from you historically how different people have approached leveraging the power of a meal, which people have to have anyway,
Right.
to really accomplish these important personal and professional goals.
That's a fantastic question. And I think that you're absolutely right that a meal is only special if it's shared with people with whom you have some kind of important connection, political, social, business connection, because you remember that meal better than any other. I don't know if that's true for you. You remember where you were, you remember sometimes what you ate. And I don't know if I'd go so far as to have an official kind of, you know, we're going to talk about this, because it seems to me what works so beautifully in a good meal is the development of conversation that the food itself may spark, that the waiter or waitress might spark, that look who's sitting over there, why is that person here, what are they talking about? It's, you know, I can give you examples historically of people being murdered in restaurants, people starting revolutions in restaurants, people getting up on tables and organizing workers and to rebel against the Russian Tsar. There are, you know, there are those moments in restaurants. There's Oscar Wilde sitting in a restaurant and having a fight with Whistler about who's the best, who has the best, what would you call it? Who has the best discussions in the restaurant? Does Whistler have them or Wilde have them? They used to sit together, then they sit at different tables and have their own groups. So it's a, you know, there are so many possible ways that a meal works. And one of the ways that it doesn't work is when people don't talk with one another, when they just sit there quietly, or they scowl, or they don't want to be part of the conversation. I think that is the kind of antisocial behavior that doesn't work in business, it doesn't work in life, and it doesn't work at a meal. So I just would wonder about having the an official conversation that's supposed to happen. I think that might constrain it a little bit. I'd love to have dinner with you and some of your friends. It would be great to do that. Let me end on one thought. When I wrote a piece that sort of snuck its way into this book about ancient eating forms, that commensality. And then these were a bunch of archaeologists and ancient historians, and it was in Germany, in Berlin. And at the end of the meal, we all went out the night before to make sure we knew what we were going to talk about. Everybody paid for their own food. And I, on the next day, talked about that. And I said, when everybody pays for their own food separately, have you really eaten together in public? Or have you eaten privately together? And literally, I don't know if you've eaten in German restaurants, you will have someone coming around with a you know, a wallet, and they will remember what everybody ate, and they will charge them each individually and pay in cash. And people would say, I ate one piece of bread and I'll pay for half of that bottle of wine. So it's that part that disturbs me. When, if we're eating together in public, we don't pay for our own food, we pay together as a group. So I think it's Georg Simmel, a wonderful European philosopher, economist, said, nobody can really eat any food but the food they themselves eat. So they really don't eat together unless they have these conversations. In other words, you eat your food, I eat my food. That doesn't mean we're eating together unless we're talking, unless we're having that kind of social connection. So hope that's a decent answer for you.
That was a wonderful answer. And I think this whole conversation actually gave us so many ways to elevate all the meals that we're going to have throughout our lives by, you know, diving into some of the anecdotes you shared, the historical developments, but also just being more mindful and conscious of the fact that, you know, when we are out with other people and eating, you know, that is something truly special and what makes us human in many ways. So really want to thank you, Elliot. I want to encourage everybody who's here and who's going to be listening to this subsequently. The book is called Dining Out, A Global History of Restaurants. So we'll be sending you more information about that. And we're going to be hosting Elliot and his co-author, Katie Rawson, in Miami for our IB chapter there, and hoping to also host you in many other places as well. Elliot, thank you so much for being here and for so enthusiastically sharing all your learnings about the subject. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Barry. I enjoyed it.
Looking forward to our meal together. And thank you, everybody, for dialing in. All the best.